Hey, Lisa.
Everyone, we are going to wait just a couple more minutes. We've got a few more people trying to log in, so we're going to give them a little bit more time to join, and then I will introduce our speaker for the evening. There is a chat function. If you go on your computer screen down to the bottom of your screen where it says more, you can check on that, and there's a chat option. So if you have any questions during the meeting, if you want to type it in there, we'll be able to get those answered by the end of the meeting for you.
Lisa, we are not getting Eric's picture.
Okay, I think we'll get started here. It looks like Eric is ready. We have a few more people still looking to join, so I'm gonna be letting them in as they are able here. But I wanted to thank you all for being here tonight virtually, and we have some people here in the room. We are very excited to have Eric Hemingway with us tonight. He is the Director of Repatriation, Archives, and Records for the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians. And Lowell and the area around us here has a long history with the Odawa, and the museum is really committed to preserving and presenting that history. So we are thrilled tonight to have Eric with us. He is a wealth of knowledge, and we're really excited for you to be able to learn from him tonight. Eric's going to explore the long history of the involvement of the Odawa of Michigan, and the involvement that they had in the events leading up to the Revolutionary War and beyond. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Eric Hemingway, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
All right. Well, thank you, Lisa. Well, first, I want to say thank you for having me tonight and being here. I always am very humbled by having any type of audience, whether it's virtual or in person. And tonight, we're going to talk about something I feel is sorely underrepresented in public schools and public space, and that's the large involvement that the Odawa have had in helping to create and shape the United States of America. And I started out doing this program as, Odawa in the Revolutionary War, which they were, but then I just can't talk about that one singular event without talking about what happened before the Revolutionary War and then what happened. So in my mind, as a historian, there's a long series of conflicts that take place in the Great Lakes, stretching from what we call the 7 Years' War to the War of 1812. And for Native people, this is a continual conflict You get a break for a decade or so, maybe. Then another war pops up, another conflict, and you go right back into fighting. So it's really impossible for me to talk about one of these in isolation. I think they really have to be looked at as a series of events, and the series of events are through my lens. I don't represent all Native people. I don't represent all the Odawa or Ojibwe or Potawatomi. I represent Eric the Odawa from Cross Village, and that's all I can do. So I'm trying to do the best I can with that. So without further ado, we'll get into it and look at a pretty tumultuous and influential period of history for us as Odawa, but also the Great Lakes and the United States. So first off, what wars? When I was in public schools many years ago, we touched on the Revolutionary War, of course, but everything else kind of we didn't mention at all. So I think that's a real disservice to all students. So we got to start somewhere with this, and we'll start with the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War. Pretty famous war. It's an international war, often dubbed the First World War because it was fought on several different continents. And the French and the British were going at it in Africa and Europe and North America and even Asia. And there was a large theater of this taking place here in the Great Lakes. And it's kind of a misnomer. It's not the French and the Indians fighting each other. It's the French and the Indians fighting against the British. But it's also called the 7 Years' War from 1754 to 61. And we'll look that there was some pretty major war or battles taking place in the Great Lakes in relation to that war. And right on the heels of that war is the Pontiac's War. And in my mind, this is just a continuation of the French and Indian War, just minus the French. That the tribes said we never surrendered to the British after the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. The treaties were signed, but the tribes were never brought to the table as part of that treaty process, that peace agreement. So the tribes were very much allies to the French, or I should say the French were allies to the tribes. And we fought, our men died, and at the end of the day, the French surrendered, and they surrendered without any type of native blessing or even being present at the table. So in the tribes' minds, the war wasn't over, and a guy by the name of Pontiac took up the battle in 1763, and often called Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's War. Pontiac was an Odawa from northern Ohio, and I often not joke, that he's probably the most famous native ever, because there's a whole series of cars named after him. There's a town named after him. In terms of branding and name, I don't think anybody's more known in the native as a native than Pontiac. I mean, I grew up loving muscle cars, GTOs and whatnot, and Firebirds, and I was like, why is my guy, put on the label of these cars? But branding and appropriation is a whole nother topic for another talk. But Pontiac, he was an Odawa from Toledo. And that war ended literally that year in 1763. And we have a short reprieve, a little over a decade, and then something called the Revolutionary War takes off. And everybody knows about the Revolutionary War, pretty big event. But most people don't know that a lot of tribes are fighting in that war. And we were fighting against the Americans. So it's a very complicated time where at one point the British are your enemies, and then you side with them against a new enemy, and that would be the United States. And many Odawa and Ojibwe and Potawatomi from Michigan fought in that war. And we were on the losing end of it, obviously. And the United States establishes itself, but it's not the power that it would become at this point. And things turn very ugly in what they called the Old Northwest in Ohio and Michigan and Indiana in 1790 to 94. It's often called Little Turtles War or the Old Northwest War. So at this time, the frontier of Ohio and Indiana is a pretty brutal place. There's a lot of violence between settlers and tribes. It goes both ways, and it accumulates into war. And the tribes are actually winning in the early parts of this war. St. Clair's defeat, Harmer's defeat, but ultimately we will lose. And the Treaty of Greenville would end that war in 1795. And so again, there's a little reprieve, a little over a decade again, and then the War of 1812 breaks out. So you can see from 1754 to 1812, it's just continual fighting here in the Great Lakes. whether it's Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, New York, Ontario, Quebec, all of these places are hosting a lot of battles over a long period of time. And so, in my mind, as a historian, they're not isolated, they're all interrelated. You can't have one without the other, and especially for tribal people. So, the Odawa fight in all of these wars, so, every single one. And we're going to look at some of the details of this. So, when I go into high schools, which I spend a fair amount of time in nowadays, in middle schools, why fight? And obviously, fighting is not the first choice. People don't want to send their people off to battle because a lot of these guys who are fighting are not just strictly warriors or soldiers. They're fathers or brothers, they're farmers, they're hunters, they're fishermen, and you lose these people in your community. It suffers. If you're a great fisherman, then it's not just your family, but the entire community suffers. Or if you're a great hunter. So it wasn't a decision that was made lightly to go into battle. There was a lot of discussion, amongst the families and the communities. And each tribe operated independently. There was no great Odawa chief who told everybody what to do. Each community had its own chief, and it really drove the Europeans nuts because they're like, well, who's your king? And they're like, we don't have a king. Well, who's your main chief? Like, we don't have a main chief. Like, everybody operates on their own pretty much, and then they come together when they need to. So very different than how the Europeans and Americans were viewing the world, with top down, the one guy who would kind of dictate to everybody else. But the tribes didn't do that. So why fight? Homelands. It starts with everything revolves around the land. And we believe we've been here for thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans, and our roots are very, very deep in our homelands. And just this year, I was out in New Mexico in one of their parks. I forget if it was a state or federal park, but they found footprints, and they were preserved, and they were 23,000 years old. These are some very, very old human footprints, not Neanderthal or Cro-Mag, but human. And this blows the timeline out of how long people have been here. But you ask tribal people, and like, well, the timeline is going to go back even further because we believe we've been here since day one. So time immemorial. And we believe that as Anishinaabe people too. The Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi together are the Anishinaabe. And we believe we've been here for a very, very long time. So when you're there for a long time, you fight for it. And it's also about natural resources. The lakes, the rivers, the woods, the streams, the fish, the game, the agriculture. This is where we've been for a very long time. And this is how you survive. And I kind of joke with my high school kids, this is 1700, 1800. It's not like you're jumping in your canoe and paddling to Costco or going through McDonald's and getting food. Like, you have to grow your food. You got to make your food. You got to fish. You got to hunt. You got to preserve. And we've been doing this for such a long time. We had it down to literally a science of when to grow, what grows well, when the fish run, the habits of the animals for trapping and hunting. So this is how people fed themselves for a long time. And you take us out of this environment, and people are going to starve out. They're going to die, and they're going to suffer. So this is one of the most obvious reasons, is just for providing and having those resources. But it goes beyond your simple food and water, but cultural resources, sacred resources. So there's a lot of burials and sacred sites and historic sites to the Odawa and the other tribes in the Great Lakes that are part of our cultural fabric, our DNA. And we are going to fight for those. And one of the main ones was our burials. So we have a very deep connection with our ancestors. We have multiple ceremonies to honor and to take care of them. And in order to do that, you have to be at the place. So we still do that to this day. Right now in northern Michigan, we're gearing up for what we call ghost suppers. And these are community feasts hosted by Odawa families if they so choose. And this goes on in Grand Traverse County and in Emmett County and other areas too. That we have suppers where we not only have, it's not quite a memorial, but we are feeding our ancestors. So when we have the ceremony, we are connecting with them. And this is an ancient ceremony, one of our longest continual ceremonies in our culture. So it's not just the basics of food and water, it's also the cultural resources that we're fighting for. And the sense of place, we're familiar with everything, and we're familiar with our neighbors, our natural environment. And this is a harsh environment to live in 200-300 years ago. You know exactly where to get water, how to make your home, where to get fuel, all the medicinal plants that you need to make yourself well, because people did get sick and we didn't have Rite Aids or ER. So you had to make your medicines, and these are all out of plants. You take an Odawa and stick them in the desert, they're not going to know what to do. You know, how do I get food? How do I get water? Where are my medicinal plants? And also, I use this word not lightly, but it's invasion of a foreign people into native homelands. So nobody ever invited Europeans here. They all came on their own in the 1500s and 1600s under this idea of manifest destiny, that it was their God-given right to come here and claim the land and resources as their own. It was their divine right. And everybody here that is native were savages. And savages legally cannot own land. They cannot, they could possess land, but they could not legally own it. And it became this reasoning for dispossession of native lands and also for acts of violence. So I hear, I grew up with the term settler and explorer in schools, but another term to think about is invader or invasion if you flip it around. But we don't usually talk about that in our our history classes in school, but that's essentially what was going on. And when people are coming in and they're taking, there's going to be pushback no matter what. And every single tribe across the United States has had their conflict with Europeans and Americans, starting with the Pilgrims, the colonists, Powhatan's War, King Philip's War, and this just stretches across the continent until you get into the late Plains Wars in the 1870s and 80s. So tribes resisted on every level at every place, including here in the Great Lakes. So this is one of the earliest, we have some people who need to mute, thanks. So this is one of the earliest sketches I've been able to find of an Odawa man. This is 1666. And this is in the Upper Peninsula, and it's from the Codex Candidia, and it's from a French explorer, I believe. It's either LaSalle or Novell, one of the two. And he's just going through and he's sketching what he's seeing. And I like this a lot because this is one of my guys from back in the day, over 400 years ago. And he's distinct looking. He doesn't look like a Plains Indian. He doesn't look like, somebody from the desert or, somebody from the West Coast, a Tlingit or a Haida. This is an Odawa guy right at contact with Europeans. And he's heavily tattooed. All these marks are tattoos, permanent. And he's covered and head to foot. So I'm big into tattoos at this point. I get a lot of inspiration from these old sketches of what to do. And don't have any face tats yet or neck or anything like that, but definitely have some other, legs and whatnot back. But anyway, this guy is called the Firebringer, and he's one of the leading war chiefs for the Odawa. And he has a large megaphone up to his mouth of birch bark. That's what's up there calling his warriors into action. And they're going on the warpath against the Lakota. So tribes did fight amongst themselves. We didn't all get along. We're humans. And not every tribe is the same. We're not all one people. There's a lot of distinction between us. But a lot of these tribes put their grievances and beefs amongst themselves aside, and they had to face a bigger problem. And that was the Europeans and later the Americans. So some one-time enemies or rivals like the Lakota or the Iroquois, we would band together during the War of 1812 and Revolutionary War and say, we got to fight together to keep our lands. But this is one of the earliest sketches of an Odawa from Michigan. And I think he was up by Keweenaw Bay. So I don't know what he was doing up there doing Odawa stuff at the time, probably fishing, getting some guys together to go on the warpath, but that's the Firebringer. So this is a Robert Griffin painting. Robert Griffin's a pretty prolific contemporary painter, and his whole focus is 1700s. He does his research. He's very much into detail, and so I like to use his works because I think they depict the time rather well of the 1700s. And the Odawa were prolific paddlers. They were prolific voyagers on the great seas of the Great Lakes. And we've been doing this for thousands of years. We didn't all of a sudden learn how to paddle and navigate and go on the water once Europeans arrived. We've been doing this for a very long time. And they had these large birch bark canoes. And some of these canoes were over 30 feet long, and they could haul up to 4 tons of goods plus your paddlers. So they were mini vessel or mini freighters, I call them, where they were trading corn and maple sugar and meat and goods, and they would travel as long as the trade, as long as the water was open, they're out on the water trading, and they'd go as far as Quebec into Minnesota, um, northern Lake Superior, down to Chicago, Detroit. They were all over the place trading all the time. So that was another reason that we were taking up arms, is to protect our economy, that these other people were coming in and trying to claim our goods, our resources for themselves so they could profit. And so we wanted to protect our economy, protect our trade. That was just one of the components also that was fueling all these conflicts that were going on here in the 18th and 19th century. So this is a map put together from historic documents of just where the Odawa were going in the 17 and 1800s. And it was everywhere. This is, months of travel on the lakes and the rivers. And, Lake of the Woods is up there. That's a place where you probably, when you get there, you're going to spend a year or two trading for goods. And a lot of times people would marry into families in these really remote communities, whether it's Ojibwe or Cree. And you had to have family ties, because if you didn't have family ties and you're going in a place and taking resources, it could be a big trouble for you. You might get bumped on the head, so to speak. So a lot of people married into these communities, and they had these trade networks that were tied in with kinship networks. And you can see that the route to Quebec is along the Ottawa River, and that river is named the Ottawa River because there was so many Odawas trading on the river, that they had the rights to the river. So people would actually have to ask permission at some points. Can I go there? And the Odawa would tax them and say, I want a certain percentage of your goods as you pass through. And that was that. So the original name of that river for the French was the Algonquin River, but the Odawas are on it so much, they said, no, we got to change it to the Ottawa. So that says quite a bit. And Lake Nipigon and northern Lake Superior. Lake Superior, freighters sink in this lake. It's big, it's mean, but my ancestors were scientists. They knew when to travel, how to travel. They read the weather very well. They weren't going to challenge the lake, and they would pull off and camp if they needed to for a few days to let weather go by, and they would do so accordingly. So this is just a little bit of all the different routes that the Odawa were engaging in trade in the 17 and 1800s. So the leaders for these wars, and this is from an Odawa perspective because that's who I am and where I'm from. And so hopefully this will kick off, a Potawatomi perspective and an Ojibwe perspective, because we're all different. So the French and Indian War, the main guy in the entire war for the natives, and largely the French too, is a guy named Charles Langlade. I can't pronounce his whole French name. The French names are like 20 words, but Charles Langlade was the man for all the tribes. He was the main war chief. Akiakwadazi is his Odawa name. He who is fierce for the land. It's a pretty boss name, but he was a pretty boss guy. And he was born in Mackinac, and he was part of a pretty powerful Odawa family. His uncle was Nissaquat, the main Odawa chief for the area, and Nissaquat's sister, Damatilde, was Langlade's mother. So his mother was Odawa, his dad was a French officer, and he just grew up in it, so to speak. And he first went on the warpath at 10 years old. His uncle Nissaquat said, I think there's something very powerful about this young man, and we want to take him on the warpath. So he asked his sister, and she said yes. And they marched him all the way to Tennessee to fight against the Chickasaw. So they walked all the way from Mackinac to Tennessee. And Charles was too young to fight, but he watched and he learned and he saw how things were done. And this would be his kind of inaugural foray into war. And he's only 10. And so they won the battle. And Nissaquat said, yes, I was right. He has a knack. He's good luck. This guy will be very successful. And they brought him back. And he led his first war party as a young man down to Piccolini, Ohio. And this is really the battle that lit the fuse for the French and Indian War in North America. And The hostilities were simmering, but Langlade led a group of Odawas down into Ohio at that time to stop the Miami and the British from coming in and trading and setting up forts. And that battle ignited the French and Indian War in North America. Langlade was successful in the battle, and he would fight in some other major battles during the French and Indian War. Braddock's defeat, very famous battle outside Fort Pitt, Fort William Henry, the siege of Quebec. He would defeat Robert Rogers, Daniel Boone, and also, in my opinion, George Washington. George Washington only surrendered one time in his whole military career, and it was at Fort Necessity. And Fort Necessity is the only national park in the NPS National Park Service that is dedicated to the French and Indian War. It's because George surrendered there. And at that battle, there were Odawa warriors present. It's in the records, but they don't name them. So I find it very hard to believe that Langlade was not there. He was everywhere else. So to say that you were, at least we can say with certainty that the Odawa were there when George surrendered. We know that. And they're probably Odawas from Mackinac. That was the hub. But pretty big names: Boone, Rogers. Langlade was beating them, and he would fight in numerous frontier battles. And he would also fight the Americans in the Revolutionary War. He was one of our main war chiefs during the Revolutionary War, and he would lead Odawa warriors out of Mackinac to fight in the Revolutionary War, primarily New York. So, as the legend goes, he fought in over 90 battles and survived every single one. And later on moved to Wisconsin when he was no longer in fighting shape, so to speak. So he's a pretty influential guy in the Great Lakes, but he's also very well known in France. I mean, I've talked to some French scholars and they're like, yeah, Langlade, they knew about him immediately. I'm like, yeah, he was our guy out of Mackinac. I guess Mackinac City would say today. So again, this is another Robert Griffin painting, and this is him depicting the French and Indian War, the siege of Fort Pitt. These native warriors are getting ready to go and attack, making a plan, and these guys were very minimalist. They didn't have a lot of gear. They had their weapons, some knives, some food, and they traveled light and they traveled fast. And the British and the French had a completely different style of warfare before they met natives. They'd stand in lines, they'd march out into open fields and just shoot at each other. And the natives said, that's probably the stupidest thing you're going to ever do. We're going to hide and move and hit and run and attack you with sneak attacks and attack you at dawn and try to sustain as little casualties as possible. And it was really successful. And a lot of the Europeans and Americans started to adopt those fighting tactics because they were better. But when the Europeans and Americans first came here, they would march into fields and line up and then shoot. And then the people behind them would shoot. And the natives like, no, that's not how it's done. So, and they were also many times shaving their heads, have what we call scalp locks, lots of tattoos. And these tattoos would tell stories like insignias, how we have medals today for a lot of our army people. Tattoos serve that purpose too. So Pontiac, again, I argue the most famous of all native names was watching the French Indian War. I think I don't know if Pontiac fought in any of the battles, but he took up the cause after the war. And for a short time, one summer, the natives were successful in the Great Lakes. They took 9 of 13 British forts in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, New York, Indiana. It was an incredibly orchestrated attack of numerous tribes. And this is one of the famous speeches at Fort Michilimackinac in Mackinac City. And this is men of Havana. He was an Ojibwe chief addressing Alexander Henry, who was an Englishman who was captured during the Battle of Fort Michilimackinac in 1763. Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods, and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will not part with them to none. So I think that pretty much summarizes this entire 70-year period of Native people resisting that we were here, it's our land, and we're gonna fight for it. So again, Robert Griffin, pull on him quite heavily for this program. And this is what his idea of what Pontiac looked like. And this is, gleaned from historical records, a mix of European dress, traditional dress, but I want to focus on his headdress. And this is what a traditional Odawa headdress would have looked like. Not the plains Indians, the big feathers, flowing headdresses. That's Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho. That's their thing. This is ours, and it would have had flat quill work. That's what is on the headband. It's porcupine quills, and just some short tufting. So we don't know what Pontiac looked like exactly. We can only guess, but the clothing and the attire is pretty accurate. And this is Joseph Brandt. He's a little bit earlier from this time period, early 1700s. And I just threw this in because I like tattoos, and he's got some of the best I've ever seen. And Brandt, was fighting the Europeans and later the Americans in New York. So the Iroquois were definitely, feeling the brunt of what was happening, especially during the Revolutionary War. And the Iroquois have a name for the president of the United States that started with George Washington, and that's called Town Destroyer. Because during the Revolutionary War, George Washington and his men went through Iroquois villages and they razed them. They burned their homes, they took all their food and they burned it, they chased them out, and then they would put salt into the ground so they couldn't grow any crops. So they called him the Town Destroyer, and every president after George to the present day has inherited that name. So a very different view of George Washington for Native people. So to this day, the president, through the eyes of the Iroquois, are often called the Town Destroyer. So this is just a map of what was going on in 1763 in the Great Lakes. It is on fire. There is battles everywhere. And right in our own backyard, Fort St. Joseph, Detroit, Fort Michilimackinac, they're all having hostilities. New York, especially, Ohio. And like I said, the natives take the vast majority of the British forts in 1763. They actually win. But in the native world, we're not going to stay far away from our homes and occupy land. We got to go back home. We got to go back and hunt and fish and grow and prepare for winter, be with our families. So they won the battles, like, all right, we're going back. And then the British just came back in and occupied the forts. So it was a different mindset, but also at this time period, I have to say, diseases, smallpox, measles were just decimating entire tribes, not just one or two. Tens of thousands of natives are dying from smallpox. So they go fight these battles, and then unknowingly they were bringing back something much worse, and that was diseases. We had no immunity to them. There's different estimates of how many people died, but roughly 90 to 95% of Native people were dying at this time just from diseases. And during Pontiac's, or the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War, the British were distributing blankets filled with smallpox to Native communities, saying, this is a token of peace, ceasefire, but it was laced with death. And these people would bring them these blankets in their communities. Everybody would come around, and that was just how natives do things. Everybody sits and talks, and they bring the blanket out, and that was it. So they were using, I guess we would say chemical warfare at this time period, but then also a lot of settlers were bringing diseases and not necessarily distributing blankets, but they're still moving in close proximity of Native people and not moving away. And so people were just getting hammered by these diseases well up into the late 1800s. So very, very tense time here in the Great Lakes. So we get into the Revolutionary War. Odawa's fight against the Americans in this war. Our guy Langlade, he's there. Agushua, he's an Odawa from the Maumee, which is Toledo, same area that Pontiac's from. And Paquacaman Amble Chevalier is another Odawa war chief from this area of Emmett County up by Harbor Springs and Petoskey. So these guys are right from my own backyard fighting in the Revolutionary War, leading hundreds, not just a few guys, hundreds of Odawa warriors against the Americans. And the Odawa fight with the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, the Shawnee, the Delaware, Miami, many other tribes against the United States. So we have, we have our own up here in far northern Michigan fighting. And again, it's comes down to the basics of land, water, resources, that somebody's coming in and claiming them as their own. And we're saying, no, we need these. We've been here first. And so they fought for it. And this again, Robert Griffin. And this is just, I like this painting because it depicts fallen comrades. This is something we talk a lot about in other aspects of warfare. When a soldier goes down, you go get them, you bring them back. And, POWs, missing in action. Same for our guys. They wouldn't just leave somebody on the battlefield. They would do everything in their power to bring them back and bring them back home for a proper burial. So if a guy fell in battle, they just wouldn't leave him. They would try to go back and get him. So I think we all know how the Revolutionary War turned out. And the tribes weren't done. They said, okay, you establish your own country, your own place. And I highly credit Pontiac in helping to form the Revolutionary War, because after Pontiac's War in 1763, the British said, enough's enough. Fighting with these tribal people is not good. They won for all intent purposes. And we're going to create a boundary line called the Proclamation of Quebec. And that basically was the Appalachian Mountains. And it said anything west of this line, the Appalachians, is Indian country. That's where all the tribes are. Don't go over there. That's theirs. But more and more colonists were coming over from Europe every year, and they saw this was an infringement upon their rights. And this became one of the grievances against King George, was the proclamation. And the proclamation was set up by Pontiac. So in my mind, Pontiac and the tribal nations of the Great Lakes are helping to create the scenario that will become the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War concludes, the United States wins, but they're not the power that they would become in 1790. And they're pretty much a fledgling country at this point. And the tribes are pushing back. And frontier violence in Indiana and Ohio is pretty epic. It's brutal. I don't see Indiana, Ohio as the most exciting places right now, but in those times it was pretty dire. And it's settlers going on to native lands. And the natives are fighting back en masse. And some military historians argue that the worst defeat that the United States military suffered ever in any battle of any war was St. Clair's defeat in 1791. Over 1,000 of St. Clair's men would be captured or killed. And given the size of the U.S. Army at the time, it was catastrophic. And Harmers suffered almost an equally devastating defeat in 1790. I think he lost 700 men. So the United States is losing big numbers to the tribal nations, Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Miami, Shawnee. And the tides turn when they send Mad Wayne Anthony into battle at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and it squashes this resistance. And it would end with the Treaty of Greenville of 1795. I'll correct this number, 1795. So this is one of the major first treaties in the Great Lakes, but it's to end war and establish boundary lines of what is native land and what is settler land. This would be a common theme for conflict. So again, another Robert Griffin. And I like that he pulls on different historic scenarios, not just always the warriors fighting. Whoops, oh, I did that. And I like this a lot because it's a family, and this is how I can imagine things happening in the 1780s and 90s, where settlers are moving in, and you don't want to engage right away. You want to make sure your family's not harmed. And so this is a family just trying to move out and avoid conflict, avoid violence. And the mom is telling the young daughter, you got to be quiet. We got to sneak out of here and get to a safe place. So I can just imagine this happening for tens of thousands of natives on the frontier in the Great Lakes at this time period. So Little Turtles War concludes in 1795. Things are not at peace at all. There's a very, very tense underlying in the Great Lakes, and it boils over into the War of 1812. But the tribes are already engaged the Americans by 1811. They were forming war parties by 1809, 1810. And a guy by the name of Tecumseh was coming to prominence. He was a Shawnee war chief out of Ohio, and his brother, the prophet Tezcatlipoca, were forming an alliance and gathering again this coalition of tribal nations to resist Euro-American invasion into their lands. So I often say that the British efforts coincided with the native efforts. We didn't join the British. We were already fighting the Americans. And it just happened that the British and the Americans started to get into it again in 1812. In Odawa, from my area of Waganuxing, Emmett County, would ally with other tribes against the British. And it's the same argument, fighting for lands, resources, and way of life, just as all the other wars. But by this point, the population numbers had turned greatly. And all of us as Native people are feeling the pressure of American expansion. It's not just thousands, it's hundreds of thousands of people that are coming into the Great Lakes looking for land and resources. But then also frontier violence was escalating more and more in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and people traveled, they communicated, they talked amongst themselves, they knew what was happening. And there was these awful things like the Gondahooten massacre in, I believe it was 1780s in Ohio, where over 200 Delaware Christian pacifist Indians were massacred by Pennsylvania militia. They came into a different state and actually killed over 200 civilians. So this was going on pretty frequently. You know, natives attacking settlers, settlers attacking natives. It was going back and forth. And it was going to lead to war, and also feeding families. This was becoming more of a need, because when European or Americans were coming in, and Europeans, their idea of farming was very different. They would cut down large areas of woods that were used for hunting and for gathering. They would drain swamps, just really radically alter the landscape to fit their style of agriculture. And this was devastating for food production. So the warriors in chief from the war of 1812. This is a Siganak red-winged blackbird. He's from a place called Middle Village, also known as Goodhart, up in Emmett County, my backyard. And a Siganak was the main war chief for the northern Michigan Odawa. He led hundreds of Odawa warriors and up into Niagara, Prairie du Chien, Mackinac. There was 2 battles on Mackinac Island during the War of 1812, and he was involved in all of these. And he has very simple war paint. His septum piercing, his nose piercing depicts that he's a war chief. And he would lead, like I said, hundreds of warriors on the war path. And he would later leave Michigan after the war and establish a community on Manitoulin Island called Wikwemikong. And that's still there to this day, because he was so worried about Indian removal, because after the war, everybody gets pushed out, that he goes, I'm not going to risk it. I'm going to go back to Manitoulin and establish a community. And they're still there. They're still there to this day. So very influential person in not just American history, Odawa, but also Canadian. This is Mukmanish. He is one of Siganak's right-hand men in the battle. He's a war chief. He's from my home, Cross Village. And Mukmanish means, his name is Little Bad Knife Nobody Cares About. So I don't know the story behind that name, but it's a really cool name. And he fights alongside a Siganak. Sometimes he fights on his own with his own war party. Great story. He's at Prairie du Chien. It's 1814, late in the war. And he's down in southern Wisconsin. And he gets shot in the knee. And his warriors go capture the person who shot him, which turns out to be a very young boy, they say in the records, probably 12 or 13. And they drag this kid before Mukmanish. And one of the warriors is going to put his tomahawk in his head. And Mukmanish says, nope, we don't kill civilians. We don't kill captives. And the warriors are like, this guy just shot you and maimed you. And he goes, no, he's a prisoner now. And that's unhonorable. So they drug this boy all the way up to Mackinac and turned him over to the British on Mackinac Island. And the commander at the fort said, why didn't you just kill him? And they're like, no, it's unhonorable. He said, this is a great thing that you did. And they gave him this sword. And that's what's on his waist. and it's actually one of the Canadian treasures from the War of 1812. It's in the Canadian Museum of War. So it's on my bucket list to go over there. And if I ask nicely, can I hold the sword? I'm actually from his home, Cross Village. He's my guy. I'll be very disappointed if they didn't let me see the sword. I don't know if they'll let me hold it, but um, during the war, there's a lot of violence towards civilians on both sides. And so the fact that these guys are saying that that's not what we do is really remarkable. Chabanais, he's in Odawa, and this is an actual photo of Chabanais, obviously much later in life after the war, I think in the 1860s. He's in Odawa from the Detroit area, but he becomes the chief of his Potawatomi's wife's village in Illinois. So he's a chief of a Potawatomi village, and he fights alongside Tecumseh. And you don't get any bigger than Tecumseh in Native story history. He's the man, and he fights alongside with him. He fights at it's a very horrible event. It's called the Massacre at Fort Dearborn, which is Chicago in 1812. And a lot of Potawatomi warriors go and attack civilians who are departing under a white flag. So very ugly event. I think it's a lot of revenge killings that are happening from their people being killed. Chabanais hears about this. He rides to the massacre, and he's late. He wants to try to save people. He hears that there are some women and children in a cabin hiding. He goes to the cabin, gets there in the nick of time. Some Potawatomi warriors show up, and they tell him, you need to move, or you're going to end up, with them in the afterlife. Chabanais doesn't. He stands literally in the doorway of the cabin saying, this isn't honorable. We don't do this. And he's about ready to meet his maker. And then a very powerful war chief, Billy Caldwell, who's Potawatomi, shows up and says, nope, we're done. Stop. So Chabanais risks his life to save white civilians. After the war, he's trying to live peacefully in Illinois, and another war breaks out, and that's his Black Hawk's War in 1832. Black Hawk is a Sauk. He fights in the War of 1812 alongside Chabanais and Tecumseh. He has his own war for 1 year in 1832. It's a very horrible event, and that Black Hawk at the end is just trying to reserve lands for his people, and they take up arms, and Chabanais is asked to fight with Black Hawk by Black Hawk himself. He refuses, says, I'm done fighting. We got to live peacefully, got to make it work. Black Hawk doesn't like this at all. And Chabanais goes a step further, and he hears about some raiding Sauk warriors who are about ready to attack American towns in northern Illinois in 1832. He rides to these villages and says, you have to leave or you're going to die. The people who listen live. The people who don't die. The Sauks do come and they kill some civilians. So what would you think his reward for saving Americans twice in his life would be? That he was removed under the Indian Removal Act. So this is a law that was passed in 1830, almost immediately after the War of 1812, where over 200,000 natives would be removed to Kansas and Oklahoma. Thousands would die on these marches, and thousands would die when they get to Oklahoma, Kansas, because they have no food, no water, and sickness has taken hold. So this is Chabanais' reward for being a hero. He's removed to out west. And where do you think they put him? They put him right next to the Sauks. And the Sauks immediately kill his son and his nephew for not following them. Chabanais takes his family and they leave, and they come back to northern Illinois, and he lives out the rest of his days. So one more bucket list place for me is to go to Chabanais' burial ground in central Illinois and pay my respects. It's literally in the middle of nowhere, but we know where he's at. So, really great hero for the tribe. Jinghua Kuntz, Little Pine Tree, he's out of Sault Ste. Marie. He is the main Ojibwe war chief in the upper Great Lakes for the Ojibwe, and he fights at Mackinac. He fights in many battles, and Jinghua Kuntz would go on to fight for tribal rights for the tribe after the war, for lands, for education. So a lot of these warriors were very talented orators and leaders. They just weren't, these barbarians or savages. Once the war was over, they pivoted and said, okay, we got to use diplomacy. We got to, use our heads. in order to make it through. And Xinhua Kunz was definitely one of those guys. So if you go up to Sault Ste. Marie, Canada, in the States, they have schools named after him, roads. He's a really well-known guy up there. And that is Black Hawk. So this is from the McKinney Hall portraits. That's the actual portrait of Black Hawk. And he has a biography called Black Hawk's Life. And it's his own words of what happened in his life. It's a really powerful read. And but one I think it ties directly into what was happening here in the Great Lakes. In Tecumseh, you can't talk about anything without talking about Tecumseh. In my mind, the greatest Native leader in the last 300 years. And he led a coalition of dozens of tribes who often didn't agree with amongst themselves to come together and fight against, this invasion of their lands. And he died in 1813 at the Battle of the Thames River, just outside of Windsor. So I did get to go to that spot as a bucket list where he fell on that place. There's a giant memorial that has been erected by the Canadian government. And he has a very powerful story. And there's a biography called Tecumseh, A Life by John Sugden. It's about 600 pages. So if you need some reading for the winter, it's a great book. It's not just about Tecumseh, but about this whole war of 1812. And he saved American civilians multiple times in his life from being killed, and just a very honorable person. But in the end, he was a martyr. He died in battle, died for the cause. And I kind of joke, but not joke, Canada has claimed him as a national hero. I'm like, he's from Ohio. He just died over in Canada. So he's our guy. You can't take him. So these are battle sites with major Indian participation during the War of 1812. You're going to see Detroit is a hot spot down by Fort Meigs, Fort Portage, Niagara, and then Michilimackinac. So shameless plug for the Mackinac State Historic Parks. I work a lot with them on a lot of different projects, and they actually reconstructed Fort Michilimackinac, and they do programs there, and you can actually walk on the grounds where that battle took place in 1763 under Pontiac's War. And then you can go over to the island, and they still have the fort up and running from the War of 1812. So two very historic places up in the Upper Great Lakes that are part of the Mackinac State Historic Park system. So you can go there and actually walk on the grounds. The Fort Michilimackinac fort is obviously not the original fort, but the fort on the island is. So pretty cool stuff. So the aftermath of war is pretty severe. Forced relocation. The Indian Removal Act kicks in almost immediately. Thousands of natives are removed to Oklahoma, Kansas. There are over 50 removed tribes. It's not just Cherokee out of Georgia. There's Potawatomi removed from St. Joseph, Battle Creek, Michigan. So this is a Michigan story. There's forced assimilation, loss of land and resources, loss of lives. A lot of hard decisions for chiefs and villages. What do we do? Some go to Canada. They go to Manitoulin Island. They go to Wapuu Island. Some stay here and just gut it out. They make agreements called treaties with the federal government, which is a whole nother talk. And then they have to deal with these removal laws and civilization laws. So the United States government had these civilization policies that aim to change us. Our language, our culture, religion, appearance, all were subject to change under these policies. So pretty intense time right after the war. And so this is, it's called the Royce map, and it's from the Bureau of Ethnology. And this is a federal map. And this shows all the different treaties. So these agreements that the tribes had to make with the federal government within one generation after the War of 1812. And all these different colored areas represent different treaties. And the treaties essentially were to avoid removal. So the big yellow area is a treaty of 1836. 6 different tribes signed that, my tribe included. This pink area is a treaty of Saginaw, 1819. The green is the Treaty of Detroit, 1807. This is the Treaty of Chicago, 1821. And this is the Treaty of La Pointe, 1842. Pretty close together. And all these treaties are made with one thing one goal in mind, and that's stay home. avoid removal, avoid Kansas, Oklahoma, because if you go out there, it's going to be bad. And so this is how Michigan becomes Michigan. This is how the feds acquire all the land. And through this whole process, the tribes are able to stay home, albeit it's very difficult, but they're home, and we're still home to this day. So there are 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan, two non-federally recognized, and Michigan has, I want to say, top 12 native populations in the state. So we have a pretty large, comparatively speaking, especially east of the Mississippi. I mean, east of the Mississippi is primarily Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. And there's some tribes, in, of course, New York with all the Iroquois. But after that, it's pretty sparse. So things changed pretty quick after all these wars for tribal people. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And it's 6:56. How about that, Lisa? Pretty good timing.
Beautiful. All right. If anyone online has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. And I will pull the people in the room here to see if anyone in the room has questions. Eric, do you know anything about Chief Noonday, who is down here in the Grand River Valley?
No, thanks for reminding me because he's one of my personal favorites. I got to start including him more in my research. So Noonday Nawagijik. Yeah, he was from Grand River, Grand Rapids. And his actual village, it was right on the banks of the Grand River where the public museum now stands. So there's a large statue of him. In Noonday, he fought in the War of 1812. And as the legend goes, when Tecumseh fell at the Battle of the Thames, Noonday was with him. And after Tecumseh was killed, several warriors went back out onto the battlefield to claim his body because the Americans promised they were going to cut him into 1,000 pieces and just desecrate his body. And so Tecumseh's, allies said, "You're not doing that to our great chief." And Noonday was one of the guys who went back on the battlefield and got his body and then hid it. So we don't know where Tecumseh's buried. Sometimes I have somebody come up to me and say, "Hey, I know where Tecumseh's buried." I'm like, "No, you don't. If you did, you wouldn't say anything." But so credit Noonday as one of the guys. So, and he's one of the great leaders from Michigan, without a doubt.
What's your opinion of the Bill Kubiak paintings, drawings of the tribes for the Great Lakes Indians? Are you familiar with Bill Kubiak?
No, I'm not. I'm not familiar with those. I can't say.
Okay.
How about Kabmusa? Do you have any historical references on him?
I know who he is, but I don't have a lot of information on him. So I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. But I know who he is. I know the name, but I don't know a lot of details about him.
I can share what we've got here at the museum with you on that, Eric.
You go ahead.
I have a question. You just put the map up there, some of the recent some of the Indian treaties. One was 1836. And then Michigan became a state in 1837. How did that impact the Indians in the treaty, if you have any insight on that?
Yeah, good observation. Because in my mind, Michigan doesn't become a state in 37 without the 36 treaty. It's the largest land cession of all the treaties. It's 16 million acres. So they need the land to have, open it for settlement. And so there's this real intense push to get the treaty done. And make it as beneficial to the Americans as possible. And so Henry Schoolcraft is the Indian agent who is responsible for this treaty on behalf of the federal government, along with a guy named Lewis Cass, who's the Secretary of War. And this is under Jackson. So some pretty hostile characters towards natives. And the tribes who signed that treaty are Grand River, Manistee or Muskegon, Grand Traverse, Little Traverse, Mackinac, and Sault Ste. Marie. So it's 6 different tribes. And it's a very tense negotiation. My leaders left northern Michigan in birch bark canoes in November of 1835 and paddled all the way to Washington, D.C. to get this done. And they stayed there for about 8 weeks. And they came back in March, which isn't much better travel than December or November. But yeah, you don't have the state becoming a state in 37 without the Treaty of 36. They're directly related.
Okay, go ahead.
And one of the things that I recall the prior, maybe in that treaty, and you can reiterate it, you couldn't, as a settler, you could not go north of the Grand River until after that treaty, or maybe after we became a state where the settlers could go north of the Grand River.
I'll have to look at it again. I know there's in that area of, like, say, Grand Rapids, south to Kalamazoo, there was numerous treaties in a very short amount of time. There's a Treaty of St. Joseph, the Treaty of Chicago. There's like 4 or 5 treaties within a 10-year period, which is pretty intense. And I'm pretty sure one of those state that you can't go north, but everybody's coming north anyway. So they have to make another treaty that allows the people to go north, and the tribes just kind of get rearranged, especially the Potawatomi. But there was a standing order within the Army in 1837, 38, 39 to remove all the Potawatomi from southern Michigan. So they had the mindset that we're not going to worry about boundaries and lines because everybody's going to get removed. And so, and they were doing this. There was a bounty system on natives in Michigan in the 1830s. They're paying people to capture natives and ship them out west. And this is Battle Creek, Kalamazoo. This is our backyard, essentially. And most people think of Indian removal as Cherokee, Georgia. No, it's Ohio, Michigan. It's called the Northern Removal. So that was happening. That's all in context for these treaties, because if you don't make a treaty and get something in writing, the Army's going to sweep through. So that's why in my mind, these treaties happen so fast. It's just to get something done immediately, because they were coming and they were removing people.
Eric, we had another question from the audience here. Do you have a sense of how many of the Odawa became Christian during this time period? I know here locally, we had a big Baptist and Catholic presence with missionaries, but kind of overall in the state, what's your thoughts on how that impacted people's lives?
Well, it impacted it drastically. And this was the fact of civilization policies, laws, that you really didn't have a choice. You had to convert, at least the outward appearance of conversion, because there was laws that were made to convert you. And the real blatant evidence would be Indian boarding schools. So these schools were created in the late 1870s and would operate for a century across the country, including Michigan, where these kids were taken out of their homes and put in these institutions of forced assimilation. But prior to that, our religion was outlawed. There was this whole, from the church, from the government, from society, that you're a savage, a devil worshiper, and you need to be civilized. And you had very little choice in this. So people were practicing their traditions and culture secretly underground. But the outward appearance, yeah, we'll build a church, we'll go to church, we'll cover up our tattoos. And so I think a lot of people may on the outward appearance, yeah, they converted, they're Christian, but they go home and practice their culture, their old ways. Did some convert wholesale? Of course, some were devout Catholics and Christians still to this day. But I think a very large number of them were doing this so they could just, avoid hardship and also avoid removal.
Eric, is there an estimate of the population of Odawa or even all the tribes in Michigan, say in 1836 or that period there?
Oh, there are numbers are really spotty because people are still moving around quite a bit in that time period. You know, there might be a family hunting over here or growing over there. I want to say, and this is a wild stab right now, about maybe 40,000 total. That's just a real rough number. So there was a decent amount, but compared to the settlers, which was in the hundreds of thousands and quickly into the millions, we were outnumbered pretty quick.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, does anyone else online have any questions? All right, well, I would like to thank Eric for being with us this evening and sharing all this wonderful information. We appreciate it, and it was good to see you again.
Well, thank you for having me tonight. And yeah, hopefully we can reconvene at some point, talk about something of a different nature, maybe a little bit lighter, but Native history is never that light, but it's true and it's honest. And yeah, hopefully we can see you in the future.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.